We see the right wing trying to ban books. We see the right wing trying to control history. We see the right wing banning DEI initiatives. We see the right wing specifically threatening and intimidating educators, specifically public schools, and trying to eradicate public schools. But what you mentioned in the book, which I found was fascinating, is the intrusion of this money, not just in politics, but in education. Can you connect the dots and can I explain how they spent money to indoctrinate our children about the ideology of the free market in public schools?
Yep. So yet another one of the outcomes of these campaigns, and we can start this one in the 1920s, there was an effort to finish electrification of the United States. Basically, electricity is created by private entities in the 19th century. It spreads very rapidly to the city borders, and then it stops. And so the benefits of electrification don't get out to the countryside. And a lot of reformers, people who would have been seen themselves as modern progressives back then, wanted to use government, either state or federal, to electrify the countryside. And the electricity utilities, the businessmen, decide, well, they don't want that. They see it as socialist, interfering with the prerogatives of business. And so they go on a lobbying campaign that includes creating materials, textbooks, and so forth for the schools, public schools and university level schools, to indoctrinate students into the idea that private industry alone can provide the services that Americans need, and that anything other than private industry would be socialist and un-American and anti-freedom, and they don't quite construct the slippery slope argument that we get in the 1930s, the tripod of freedom that I mentioned before. But this is where this whole idea of a textbook campaign, for example, starts, and then
but they plant the seed.
Common.
The seeds are
they
planted.
Plant the seed. Exactly. Yeah. They begin planting the seeds there. We even go back further. They didn't do a text back campaign around this, but the opposition, the effort to prevent regulation of child labor was even earlier and similar, except they don't get to this textbook campaign idea.
And just, funny enough, here we are with the current rules in Arkansas that have rolled back protections for child labor because apparently we're in the nouveau 2020s, which is actually a throwback to the 1920s.
Yeah. These babies can pull themselves up from their osh-kosh begosh baby straps, Danielle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Stop coddling
19th
them.
Century man. It's 19th century all over again. It's depressing and demoralizing. And I wondered when Naomi decided, it's Naomi that decided we needed to deal with child labor. And this was years ago, of course, because we didn't know any of this would happen. And it's like, well, she was prescient. Maybe she saw it coming.
But it's so, I want to talk about that for a minute, because the child labor piece that we are seeing get traction on the far right now is something that is also intertwined with, racism and white supremacy. It isn't their children that they are talking about. It isn't white children that they're talking about that are going to be working overnight at the McDonald's. It isn't white children that are going to be at the meat packing plant working until 2 a.m. with equipment that could take off a limb, right? And so I just wanted, if you could speak to what differentiation you have seen with the 1920s and this idea of child labor that then had an entire lobbying movement to push away from, and then how we find ourselves back there also at the similar time around, our anti-immigrant policies that these same states are pushing.
Well, so the way they went about trying to prevent regulation of child labor in the first place was a family-based argument that by inserting the state between parents and child, you were taking away the family's freedom, by which they really meant the father's freedom to determine, what his sons and daughters could do.
Wait, Eric, are you talking about parents' rights
Yes. Yes. That's exactly the way this was fought in between really 1890 and the 1920s. And so it didn't get into this idea of immigrants. I mean, what I understand, and I've not been able to follow it super closely, is that they're mostly using immigrant children who have been separated from their families already, and therefore basically the most exploitable labor possible.
God.
Yes, because there's no one is coming to look for them, and no one cares. No one essentially, quote unquote, cares about them.
Yeah, so
right?
that's different, right? That's about as anti-family an argument in favor of labor that I can imagine, right? So that's, you asked for a distinction, and to me, that's it. They've decided to weaken child labor laws because certain kinds of businesses want this sort of labor, and what do you know? We have this unusual set of child immigrants, youth immigrants coming from, I guess, largely South and Central America, who are extremely exploitable, and apparently state governments are permeable enough to business interests to go for that.
Right, because of course you don't want these children, they need to be able to pull their weight. We don't want them to be a burden on the state's economy. And so we can't just put them into foster care or school after ripping them away from their families that then we didn't even put together a fucking Excel sheet to figure out how we would reconnect these kids. So we might as well put them to work.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that movie. I don't know if you all have seen it, called Snowpiercer. Where you find out that this train that is keeping humanity alive, the parts are disintegrating, Danielle, and you find out in the end, spoiler alert, that the supreme capitalist Ed Harris is now, instead of using new parts, literally using children. And the reason why he's using children is because they have tiny hands. And speaking about stories, again, in myths and fiction, we oftentimes... we talk about MAGA, and we talk about Trump, and we talk about Bush, and we go to the 1920s. But there is a central figure in your book which connects the dots to the dysfunction that so many people are suffering from, and that's Ronald Reagan. And you talk about how big business invested in politics. Talk to us how big business found their guy in the 1980s or even before, named Reagan, and how that has led us to this moment.
It's really General Electric that finds him. GE's a big actor in our story because GE, for the longest time was one of the largest American companies. In the 1930s, it was actually a progressive company. It was comfortable with its unions. Its CEO, in fact, was involved in the effort to construct Social Security, and after World War II, it changes very dramatically. It gets new management, and it becomes violently anti-union. They have a gentleman by the name of Lemuel Bulwer who constructed a method of essentially labor union breaking, which involved internal propaganda, involved basically take it or leave it contracting, and along the way, Bulwer and GE find Ronald Reagan, who people remember as kind of a mediocre actor, doing late in his original movie career, really kind of B and C grade comedies and so forth. And they rescue him. He's a very good speaker. I remember him as a child. He was a fantastic speaker, and he could persuade you of all sorts of terrible things. But GE hired him to do exactly that. And they did two things with him. One of them is they hired him to do a television show called GE Theater, which was a serial. Every week it was a different story aimed at spreading, the gospel of GE and of high technology, and of freedom. The second thing they did is they sent him around to GE's factories, and they had factories in almost every state. And he talked to community dinners and to political leaders and so forth. And this is throughout the 1950s. He becomes a well-known American figure, not a political figure in that sense, right? He's just on a corporate speaker circuit. He wasn't he wasn't an obvious presidential candidate in the 50s. He doesn't decide to run for governor of California until the 60s. So his third career then becomes the political Ronald Reagan that we know. He runs for governor of California on a platform you're not going to like. One of the big concerns in the California electorate in the early 60s was, they don't put it this way, but was restoring the right of property owners to discriminate in housing sales. Okay, this would ban by the California Supreme Court. It's put back into a ballot initiative. I believe it was in 63. It wins by like 57%, and becomes a major political issue in the state. And again, the Supreme State and federal Supreme Courts ruled against it, and so it dies then. But it helps get Reagan into the governor's mansion.